Well, hello, free people of the Rocky Mountain region, and welcome to this Free State Colorado interview. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Eddie Waldrep, a U.S. Army veteran and clinical psychologist who is also a candidate for Academy District 20 in Colorado Springs. Well, Dr. Waldrep, I hope you are well, and thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, why did you decide to run for school board?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I've been involved in the school board, kind of going to meetings and things like that for the past few years, and I started seeing a lot of political bias and a lot of what things that are coming through in the schools, and that raised some concerns for me. And as I started to attend the different school board meetings, I started to see other people also sharing similar concerns. And for myself, I started to get involved with this because I really value education a lot. I think for myself, I happen to come from a pretty rough area, and they call it kind of the barrio West Phoenix. And our teachers didn't really care that it was a bad area. They really focused on making sure we did our homework, make sure we learned how to read, do it right, do our vocabulary words. If we got them wrong, we just had to do them again. And I think that really kind of set me up with a solid foundation for later on in life when I got out of the Army and started going to school. I was able to be really successful. So I think that early childhood education is absolutely essential.
Yeah, that's a great point. So much of what happens early on in our lives really sets us up for success or failure later on. I'm lucky to have some great teachers as well. And so many people I talk to, they have fond memories of teachers from when they were, little kids and
Mhm.
the memories they got there. So I think that is so important for sure. And so kudos to you, sir. I mean, thank you for stepping up for running. These local races aren't necessarily the most glamorous. It seems like everybody wants to run for governor or U.S. Congress,
Right.
but this is so important. It's so important for the local level to get involved, to have a voice, and to stand up for parent or for kids and for parents.
Yeah, definitely. And I never really saw myself getting much into politics myself. I just kind of assumed schools were going the same way they were when I was a kid. So I wasn't really paying that much attention until really kind of came up my daughter's eighth grade year. But then when I started seeing something I thought was important, I decided to get myself involved. Some of the things I'm prioritizing my platform, like I said, is academic excellence, especially kind of K through three, really focus on those things. And then not leaving our older kids behind either. Thinking about strategies to improve their academics. Also, really building confidence in characters as a psychologist. I really think about what are some of the things that are driving the skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression in our youth, and I think there's ways we can help them by setting them up to achieve kind of tough but achievable goals. And I think that builds confidence and that carries with them as they move forward in life. And then also kind of parental rights. So there's been a lot of concerns I think that parents have had of what's happening in schools, where's the transparency at, and do I have a voice in what's happening? So those are some of the things I'm really prioritizing this run. But it has been something different to enter the political world because I want to help out with the schools, and the way to do that is by running for office, which has been a whole new sphere for me.
Well, I think you brought up such a great point too, because the schools have changed, right? I
Mm.
mean, from when I was in school, from when you were in school, and a lot of parents or a lot of adults, even without kids, really don't understand that necessarily. They say, "Yeah, school was great when I was a kid. I'm sure it's the same way. The kids
Mhm.
are safe there. They're trusted adults. They're going to learn. They're going to have good teachers, maybe like you had." But that's not necessarily, unfortunately, the reality there. Can you highlight any of the things that you've seen as a parent or as a community member in terms of the changes in the school system?
Yeah, yeah. First, I'll say there's lots of great teachers out there, and especially my daughter going to school. We have had some fantastic teachers, so I definitely don't want to throw them all into that kind of category. What really kind of caught my attention first was at my daughter's school. They had a tradition for many years. They'd read To Kill a Mockingbird, and this is at a middle school, and I think they said it's something like 14 or 17 years. So it's been going on for quite a while. And then that year, my daughter got to that time frame. They decided to change that policy. And instead of to read To Kill a Mockingbird, they kind of gave a slew of eight different kind of social justice oriented books. And so I was very curious about this. And so I attended to one of it's kind of like a webinar because it's during COVID time frame. I think when like a lot of parents are paying closer attention. And the teacher that was running that said that the reason was basically because it was told from the perspective of a white girl. And that really kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I'm in a mixed marriage. My wife is black. My daughter's mixed. We don't play the racism kind of games or do those things. And so when I heard that, that really kind of stood out to me. So I started getting more and more involved. And then the more I paid attention, the more I started seeing these things like social emotional learning, which I could talk about in terms of seeing that through a psychologist lens. but then also the critical race theory and seeing what that actually is and how it shows up in these different places. And I'm still seeing it just currently, even out knocking doors, I'm learning about more things. Just over the weekend, I knocked on a door of a father who was very disappointed that our school district is getting rid of valedictorians because his child had worked very hard to try to earn that designation for her efforts to achieve kind of academic excellence. So we want to be able to reward academic success. And of course, that's kind of related to DEI type philosophy is what really drives us. So they kind of don't have the name there, but we can see its effects. So there's lots of those things that the more you look, the more you tend to find, unfortunately.
Well, I'm definitely curious, with your background in clinical psychology, how you kind of see this SEL or the DEI or the taking away of the valedictorian. Like, what kind of an effect are all of these programs and policies having on children who are developing and kind of creating this framework for how they're going to view the world? Like we said
Mhm.
earlier, we're setting them up for kind of the rest of their lives going through some of this. So, with some of these programs, what do you see the effect being on a lot of these kids?
Yeah, well, first I'll start with the social emotional learning. Some of the programs out there, I think, are better than others in terms of if we want to think about what the intent is of those. From a psychological perspective, as at the outset, I see a problem with it being that when children are trying to develop themselves and they're trying to struggle with different emotions, things we all had to deal with growing up. Does this friend like me? Does this friend not like me? Is this one calling me names? And how do I respond to those things? It creates a lot of emotional tension for us, but we learn how to navigate those things. And one of my concerns about the social emotional learning is telling kids that for you to be able to regulate your emotions, you have to look for an external source, adults and other people to try to inform you and how to guide that process. And as a psychologist, I think about this in terms of what's referred to as self-efficacy, which is, from Albert Bandura. He's kind of a famous psychologist. If you think about psychologists, that would be a famous. But one of the main sources of developing that self-efficacy is mastery experiences. Yeah, the more that face these challenges and I learn how to overcome them for myself, that's what develops that sense of like, hey, I can handle this. I could be okay. I don't need to seek outside information to regulate myself. And so, just from a psychological standpoint, that's one of my problems I have with the social emotional learning. And then there's also on top of that, there's different models of it out there. And so, for example, one of the models that they're using here in District 20 was from the Yale Institute of Social Emotional Learning, kind of like a cell model. And if you kind of go onto what they're looking at, they have something called the transformational social emotional learning, which is basically it's kind of influenced by radical left-wing political ideology, and they're trying to kind of institute that into these programs. So I have concerns that they're trying to use that as a gateway to push political narratives, and I have a real problem with our kids or anyone else being used as like political pawns. So I'm not in favor of that. Um, in terms of some of the other effects, like for example, getting rid of the valedictorian, I mean, that could really sap the motivation for kids who are really, motivated to excel and make them stand out from their peers. Same thing with class rankings. If someone's worked really hard, we want to be able to recognize it somehow, so that way they can, put that on their applications as they're seeking higher education and some of the schools and try to further their ambitions. And so if you take those things away, there's real concern about also suffocating some of that motivation that these students have.
I really appreciate your perspective, and I think that's so interesting, because we hear about these programs, whether it's on the media, the news media, or we see it online, and to really understand kind of what it's doing to these kids, I think it is so important, and you brought up the idea of kind of almost like sheltering kids and not and holding them back from some of these experiences, these mastery experiences. And I don't
Hmm.
remember who said this quote, but they said, "The more you do, the more you can do." And I think
Hmm.
that's so much about of what education should be, right? Is like getting these kids in different experiences, different ideas. Some of it's challenging, some of it maybe is a little uncomfortable. And that's the idea because that's how you grow. But instead of saying, no, everybody's got to be in a safe space and we're not going to challenge anybody
Hmm.
and we're not going to challenge anybody's ideas. Well, yeah, you're, for lack of a better word, like creating a weak person in a way or not giving them the full experience and breadth of experience that can suit them better on in life, and I think that's such an important thing that maybe doesn't get talked about enough as it did when this kind of first program started rolling out. But these programs have continued, even though so many parents are unhappy with them. And so I'm happy to see you and people getting involved and speaking out. And I think that's fascinating being able to bring your experience to the school board and really say, hey, what are the bigger implications of what we're doing here?
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that. And I think there's one really great resource I encourage people to take a look at. There's a book called Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. So Jonathan Haidt's a psychologist. I think he's at SUNY. I think he's at City University of New York. Or I might be wrong at where he's at, but he's done a lot of great work with those things. And Greg Lukianoff, he's actually a lawyer who's associated with FIRE, or Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And that's a great book to kind of take a look at these things. They talk about some general principles, and one of them, for example, is what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, which is the exact opposite of what I was raised with, and I'm pretty sure that you were raised with, is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Those are, the way you learn to navigate, tough things is by being in tough situations and figuring your way through those things. And so it's having that direct opposite approach, trying to coddle people, trying to make things easier. And we see that in some of the effects that we have here in Colorado. So, for example, last year, more kids graduated from high school than ever before in 2024. But at the same time, their SAT scores were lower. So that the math doesn't quite work there. How's that happening? So you see, obviously, what they're doing in some places is lowering standards rather than giving kids, tough, challenges to achieve. And when they do that, they actually meet the challenge, and then they grow and they develop confidence.
Yeah, I remember being in when I graduated from high school, that senior year, the big question was who's going to be valedictorian, who's going to be salutatorian, who is, and they're striving, and there's a sense of pride, and there's this idea that your efforts have meaning, that the work you
Hmm.
put into it, you get a reward from. And ultimately, that's kind of the American ideal.
Hmm.
Ultimately, is right. We can achieve so much in our lives if we're willing to put in the work and have that kind of mindset and be self-motivated, but also motivated by some of these external awards and things like that. And that's important to, and taking away valedictorian. I
Hmm.
mean, it's sending the wrong message 100% to kids. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Oh yeah, and especially because a lot of this is geared towards things that people want to kind of use. I kind of think about it in terms of kind of faux kind of compassion. Because they're thinking, well, we don't want people to feel bad. Of course, no one wants people to feel bad, but sometimes not everything's going to work out your way. I mean, yeah, I would like to have played, more sports in school, but I didn't make the teams all the time. So that's something rough you have to deal with. And that's also good for your own motivation. You can say, all right, well, if I do want to make the team, or if I do want to make valedictorian, I have to work harder. And that spirit of competition and striving to try to better yourself are things that we really want for people to develop early in life, so because that really carries through. And we have plenty of examples too of people who had really tough challenges in life, even being bullied and things like that. And that's actually motivated them to be very successful later on. So the idea that sometimes dealing with some hardships when you're young is inherently a bad thing is not borne out by evidence, and I think most people's general experience too.
Yeah, well said, sir. Definitely. Completely agree with that. And I think that's such an important part of the conversation when dealing with education here in 2025. That's for sure. But I just want to get back to what you have listed on your website. You list
Mhm.
academic opportunities as your first key priority for District 20. So how would you like to improve the academic outcome of the students in the district?
Yeah, so first we could just start off kind of where we just had the recent CMAS kind of come out. We're at 61% reading proficiency and around 51% math proficiency. And those have been pretty stable over time. And we have 17 years of accreditation with distinction, so we want to maintain that. But I also want to see some improvement as well. I always tell my daughter the goal is 95 or above. So if you shoot for 95 or above and you land at 92, you're doing okay. So that's what I like to be able to build our district up to, of course. But that's what I started thinking about. What are the things that lead to it? And I'm not sure if a lot of people have heard about the Mississippi Miracle, which is basically what happened in Mississippi. They had been traditionally one of the lower performing states in terms of academics for quite some time. But around 2013, they decided to make changes and started to focus on evidence-based outcomes. And so they started bringing in more literacy coaches, focus on things like the science of reading, which is basically the way I think most of us were taught when we're young. Basically, these are different letters and these are the different sounds it makes. So basically, phonetics, and you learn how to pronounce words and put those things together. Some of these more questionable kind of teaching methods have come down where they use things called like three queuing, and there's a bunch of different names for it, where kids look at a word and they learn that DOG means dog, and then they learn to associate it with other things. Well, instead of teaching them phonetics where they learn those words and how to put those things together, it can be very confusing for kids. And we've seen a decline in literacy because of these things. And so I think getting back to evidence-based outcomes is a great way to do that. The science of reading, bringing in, for example, consultants and coaches to help with literacy, having the training opportunities for our teachers or continuing education opportunities. So we can streamline the curriculum with that evidence-based focus. hopefully I also reduce some of the burden because teachers have a lot on their plate too. So if they have time that they can implement a curriculum that they know is going to be effective, it's better for the students. I think the teachers are going to be satisfied with that as well. Same thing with our math. They've shown kind of bringing in math consultants and math coaching is something that really helped improve their scores. So I think really following some of these evidence-based practices is a very practical way to start to increase those scores. And so that's where we'd like to start and maintain.
No, that's great. I mean, yeah, the scores show a result, and if the result is not achieving where you want to be, well, maybe something needs to change, you know? So, I mean, it
Uh-huh.
seems so obvious in this idea of, of science where you're testing different hypotheses or testing different techniques, and then you're going to look at the evidence of that outcome, or you know what I mean, and then you're going to adjust according to that. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and it's crazy that they're not doing that now in so many ways. I'm sure some people maybe are or not surprised that that's not necessarily the case in our Colorado schools.
Well, that's for sure. And that's why they refer to that as a Mississippi miracle because their scores have improved dramatically since they implemented those things. And that's what we really want to be able to follow. Like what's working, what's shown to be effective, and how do we kind of bring those things in? And there's been one of the distinctions I've seen quite a bit is that sometimes people talk about research-based curriculums and things like that. But just because someone has done research on it doesn't mean that it's evidence that it's effective. So
Mm.
because there's a lot of things out there they have tons of research on it. People seem to like it a lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's producing effective outcomes. And that's why I really focus a lot on the evidence base for those things. And if we just keep it simple, kind of stick with the evidence base, I think it would guide us to more successful outcomes.
Nice, nice. One of the second points you list on your website for your kind of vision for the school district is character and confidence,
Mhm.
about building up the confidence of the students and setting themselves up. And I can't help but really think about that with my experience in schools and the kids who had that self-esteem, who had this mindset that they were going to be able to achieve something and had that confidence, often did. And sometimes maybe that's all it takes is that kind of mental state. So what can change? I mean, what can
Mhm.
you do, or what can the school board do to kind of change that kind of mindset in the schools?
Yeah, well, I think we really maintain, like I said, tough but achievable goals, right? So one of the things we've seen is part of the way they started to lower the standards is making it easy for kids to do things like do makeup tests, or if they don't turn something in, they turn something in late without kind of penalties. I think if we kind of raise and maintain a solid standard, and the kids know they have to meet that standard, I think that's a very initial entry point to start to develop that confidence. And then you know that if you don't, you're going to have those consequences. And so I think that's where a lot of that really starts to build from there. But then also challenging our students a lot in terms of what are the things you can accomplish and how do we recognize you for it? Valedictorian, like I said, that's one I just learned about, but that's one that really stands out. If you're able to achieve in some way valedictorian status, not only does that feel good for the student who put in that work and that effort to achieve it, but it also benefits the other ones that were trying to beat that student. If you have 10 kids all try to compete for that valedictorian slot, then everyone has have that drive, that motivation, and that's going to translate to whatever they decide to do in the future. If they go off to college or if they go into the business world or they're entrepreneurs, they're going to have that knowledge and that confidence moving forward. So those are some of the things that I think really start to develop that. And in terms of other things, in terms of character, I think what we want to have, I bring in my Army values from this. So when I was in the Army a long time ago, I used to think it was kind of cheesy. We had the Army values, loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, integrity, and personal courage, right? So leadership. Those things kind of stand out and we're accountable to them. I think having a set of values that are consistent, that aren't trying to trample on families' rights, right? So families, that's where your first learning occurs. That's where your morals and your values come from. So we want to have something that kind of supplements that in a way that's not taken away from the family or their point of origin, but something they can really build on. And I think there's a lot of room for that. We, of course, recently had the terrible tragedy of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and not only was that a tragedy in its own right, but also some of the things I've heard from quite a few people is that some of the students were celebrating this at school. And some of the kids that weren't even like necessarily fans of Charlie Cook and knew very much about him, it was hurtful for them to hear these things. They didn't know exactly how to respond. And those are some things where, we can't take over for what happens in the home, but we can try to set expectations, for codes of conduct and kind of basic civil discourse and respect, things like that within the school. So like I said, I'm not trying to replace the family or family set of values, but we can have those kind of expectations within the district.
Well, and speaking of family values, kind of the last question I really have for you today is about parental rights. And
Mhm.
often that's kind of the big elephant in the room. That's really the hot topic or the biggest talking point in terms of what's happening in Colorado schools and even in our state legislature. So
Mhm.
what can be done from the school board perspective in terms of protecting parental rights, ensuring that families are able to raise their kids without
Mhm.
too much interference from the state ultimately? What can the school boards do?
Right. Well, first and foremost, I think is really focus on transparency and actual transparency. We want to make sure that anything that's happening in the schools, the parents can have access to those things. If it's curriculum, or for example, there's some discussion around name change policies where if a kid's at school and they want to use a different name, I really support that the parents should be informed of that and they should be involved in that process and have to consent to that. Some of the policies that exist out there. Of course, I've testified against House Bill 1312, and that was up. Myself and several other physicians around the state came together to testify against those things. I think parents should be involved in all of those things, as well as the teachers too, because sometimes it compels teachers to use things that might kind of conflict with their own morals or values or their own concerns for the welfare of the kids a lot of times. So there's real concerns with that, but some of that's going to take legal processes and probably even go through maybe the Supreme Court eventually to kind of settle those. But I think transparency is important. Make sure parents are know what's happening at the school. I use an example, for myself. There's one time my daughter was at school and she wasn't feeling so well. She needed like a Tylenol or whatever it was. And my car was in the shop at the time. So I got on my bike and rode my bike to her school to kind of give her, these Tylenols because, it wasn't already pre-authorized. And so if anything as simple as ibuprofen or Tylenol, you need to have parental rights and parents involved in that. But somehow they're going to have someone change a name and not include their parents in those things. And I've had concerns with the gender affirming care as a psychologist for quite a while. The way I kind of refer to it for people is that the gender affirming care has never been evidence based. It's been purely activist driven. And you can see that it's very evidently if you look at the DSM-5, for example, for gender dysphoria. It's something that has traditionally affected less than 1% of the population. And out of that less than 1%, 50 to 98% of those kids grow out of it, or what they call desist in the literature. And so just knowing that as a base rate, less than 1%, and the majority of them are going to desist over time. There's never been any evidence space for it. And we also see things like the CAS report and the HHS report showing that things like social transition, like changing your name in school, can have harmful effects. And so I think there's real concern about those things where hopefully people get involved with their legislators and let them know, like, hey, we want to make sure that these things are consistent with the evidence and that parents are involved and not being excluded.
Wow. Well, sir, I really appreciate your perspective, appreciate your experience and your service, and really appreciate talking to you today. I think you'd provide a valuable voice on the school board, bringing your background and all this experience and knowledge, I think could be extremely valuable for the school district, for the parents, for the families involved. So wish you the best of luck. Definitely encourage people to learn more about you. And what any final thoughts in terms of how people can learn more about you or
Mhm.
any final thoughts here?
Yeah, yeah. So, Brandon, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you kind of giving me the opportunity to speak about these things. People go to my website, electeddywaldrep.com. And also, if you Google me, you might be able to find some of my writings. For example, I've had two in the Hill last year, one referring to DEI and the VA, and also about protected spaces for female veterans. Those got quite a bit of attention. I've also have articles in Wrong Speak, Unsafe Science for Lee Justin out of Rutgers, Free Black Thought. So I have some publications out there too. So if you're interested in more of some of these things, you can Google me and probably find some of the things I've written as well.
Wonderful, sir. Well, best of luck. Best wishes to you as well, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, you as well. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.